What happens when a beloved actor sits down for what should be a lighthearted chat show appearance, only to find themselves blindsided by questions they never agreed to answer? Tonight, we're breaking down one of the most jaw-dropping moments in talk show history. Kit Harington, the man who brought Jon Snow to life, walked onto the Jonathan Ross show expecting the usual banter about acting, upcoming projects, and maybe some laughs. What he got instead was an interview that went so far off the rails, it ended with him storming off set in front of a live studio audience. Before we get into exactly what was said that made Kit snap, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really happened here. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every word of this. The studio lights were bright that evening as Kit Harington walked out to thunderous applause. He was there to promote his new project, a West End play that had been getting rave reviews. The audience was excited. Jonathan Ross was his usual charismatic self, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Kit settled into the guest chair, smiling and waving at the crowd. Jonathan opened with his typical warmth, welcoming Kit and complimenting him on his recent work. Jonathan started easy, asking Kit about the transition from television to theater, about the demands of performing live every night. Kit was relaxed, giving thoughtful answers about the craft, about how terrifying and exhilarating it is to be on stage without the safety net of retakes and editing. The audience laughed in all the right places. Jonathan made a joke about whether Kit ever forgot his lines on stage the way he sometimes did on camera. Kit laughed it off, shared a funny anecdote about a minor mishap during one performance. Everything was going smoothly. Then Jonathan shifted gears. He leaned forward with that glint in his eye, the one that regular viewers know means he's about to dig a little deeper. He said, "Kit, I have to ask you something that I think a lot of people have been curious about. Your time on Game of Thrones obviously defined a huge part of your career, but there's been some talk, some whispers really, about your feelings toward the final season." Kit's smile tightened just slightly. You could see it if you were watching closely. He replied, "Well, Jonathan, I think we've covered that ground pretty thoroughly over the years. I'm proud of the work we did." But Jonathan didn't let it go. He pressed on, saying, Sure. But there were reports, weren't there? About some tension on set during that final season. About disagreements with the direction of certain storylines. I'm not trying to stir the pot here. I'm just curious about your perspective now that we have some distance from it." Kit shifted in his seat. His publicist, sitting just off camera, leaned forward slightly. Kit said, his voice measured, "Jonathan, I've always been grateful for that show and everyone involved in it. It changed my life. Where are you going with this?" Jonathan, sensing the tension, but perhaps thinking he could charm his way through it, continued, "Well, I'm going with the fact that you're an artist who cares deeply about his work. And sometimes when things don't go the way you envisioned, it can be frustrating. There were articles about you checking into a wellness facility after the show wrapped. People were concerned." Kit's jaw tightened. He said, "That was a private matter, Jonathan. I spoke about it publicly once, on my own terms, to help reduce stigma around mental health. I'm not really interested in rehashing it for entertainment." The audience had gone quiet now. The energy in the room had shifted. Jonathan, to his credit, or perhaps his detriment, tried to lighten things. He said, No, of course, and I think it's brilliant that you were open about it. Mental health is so important. I'm just wondering if there's a connection between the pressure of that final season and what you went through afterward. Surely the two things are related." Kit's eyes went cold. He said, slowly and clearly, "What I went through was personal. It involved a lot of factors in my life, not just one job, and frankly, I don't appreciate you diagnosing or analyzing my mental health struggles on your show without my consent." Jonathan raised his hands in a placating gesture. He said, "Kit, mate, I'm not trying to diagnose anything. I'm just having a conversation. This is what we do here. We talk about real things." Kit interrupted him. He said, "Real things? You want to talk about real things? Let's talk about how you just ambushed me with questions about the most difficult period of my life under the guise of casual conversation. Let's talk about how your researchers clearly dug into stories I've deliberately avoided discussing in interviews. You think because I'm here to promote a play, I'm fair game for whatever you want to ask." Jonathan's smile was still in place, but it looked strained now. He said, "Kit, I think you're overreacting a bit. We're just chatting. If you're uncomfortable, we can move on to something else." But Kit was warming up now, his voice rising slightly. He said, overreacting, "You just spent 5 minutes pushing me to talk about my mental health struggles and connecting them to professional disappointments, all while a live audience watches and cameras roll. How is that just chatting? How is that okay?" The audience was completely silent now. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked fascinated. Jonathan tried to regain control of the conversation. He said, "All right, I hear you. Let's pivot. Let's talk about the play. Your character in this production is quite different from anything you've done before." Kit cut him off again. He said, "No, Jonathan, we're not just pivoting. You don't get to poke at someone's wounds and then cheerfully change the subject when they call you out on it. Do you do this to all your guests, or just the ones you think won't fight back?" Jonathan's expression hardened slightly. He said, "Kit, I've been doing this for a very long time. I ask questions. Sometimes they're tough questions. That's the job. You're a public figure. You've been on talk shows before. You know how this works." Kit leaned forward. He said, "I know how it's supposed to work. You ask questions, the guest can decline to answer, and everyone respects boundaries. What you did was push past a boundary after I clearly indicated I didn't want to go there. That's not good interviewing. That's being deliberately provocative for ratings." Jonathan's voice took on an edge. He said, "Well, if we're being honest here, Kit, you've been quite happy to talk about Game of Thrones when it suits you, when you're promoting something. You've given dozens of interviews about the show. But the moment someone asks a slightly challenging question, suddenly it's crossing a line." Kit's face flushed. He said, "There's a difference between talking about a show and having someone try to psychoanalyze my personal mental health struggles on camera. If you can't see that difference, that's concerning." Jonathan responded, "I wasn't psychoanalyzing anything. I was asking about your experience. There's a difference between asking someone about their public statements and psychoanalyzing them. You've talked about mental health publicly, so it's fair game for discussion." Kit stood up abruptly. He said, "No, Jonathan. Just because I've chosen to be open about struggling doesn't mean you get unlimited access to that part of my life, whenever you feel like it. I shared my story to help people, not to have it used as content for your show whenever you need a dramatic moment." Jonathan remained seated, looking up at Kit with an expression mixing surprise and irritation. He said, "Kit, sit down. Let's talk this through like adults. We have 12 more minutes of scheduled interview time." Kit shook his head. He said, "No, we don't. I'm done. You wanted drama? You got it. Congratulations." He began removing his microphone. A producer rushed onto the set, trying to calm the situation. Jonathan said, his voice sharper now, "This is incredibly unprofessional. You can't just walk off a live show." Kit turned back to him. He said, "Watch me." Jonathan stood up now to his famous charm completely evaporated. He said, "You're really going to do this? You're going to throw a tantrum on live television because I asked you a few questions." Kit stopped in his tracks, turning back slowly. He said, "A tantrum. Is that what you're calling this? Jonathan, I came here as a courtesy, to talk about my work, to give your show some content. What I didn't sign up for was an interrogation about my mental health." Jonathan crossed his arms. He said, "Oh, please, Kit, you actors are all the same. You want the publicity when it benefits you. You want the platform, you want the audience. But the moment someone asks you anything with a bit of substance, you fold." Kit took a step back towards Jonathan. He said, "Substance? You think what you were doing was substantive. You were fishing for a You wanted me to trash the final season of Game of Thrones, or break down talking about therapy so you could have a viral moment. That's not journalism, Jonathan. That's exploitation." The audience was riveted now, heads turning back and forth between the two men like they were watching a tennis match. Jonathan's face reddened. He said, "I have been in this business for decades, interviewing everyone from politicians to musicians to actors far more established than you. I know the difference between a good question and exploitation. Maybe you're just not mature enough to handle real conversation." Kit laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said, "Real conversation. Real conversation happens when both people are willing participants. What you did was push and push even after I signaled I was uncomfortable. That's not conversation. That's bullying." Jonathan's voice rose. He said, "Bullying? You're going to accuse me of bullying you? On my own show? Kit, You need to get a grip. You're a grown man, not a child. If you didn't want to answer a question, you could have politely declined and moved on. Instead, you're making a scene. Kit's voice was steel now. He said, I did decline. Multiple times, and you kept pushing. That's the problem, Jonathan. You seem to think that your curiosity, your desire for content, trumps my right to set boundaries about what I discuss. Jonathan pointed at Kit. He said, You know what I think? I think you're embarrassed. I think something happened during that final season. Something you don't want to talk about, and rather than being honest, you're attacking me for asking legitimate questions. Kit's eyes widened. He said, Legitimate? Jonathan, what part of someone's private medical decisions and mental health treatment is legitimate territory for a chat show? Would you ask someone about their cancer treatment in detail? Would you push someone to relive their divorce for your audience's entertainment? Jonathan fired back. People talk about those things all the time on talk shows. When they want to, when they're ready, cancer survivors share their stories. People discuss their divorces. It's called being open. Kit stepped closer. He said, Exactly, Jonathan. When they want to, when they're ready. I shared what I was comfortable sharing about my mental health in a controlled environment. In a written statement and one carefully considered interview, I didn't agree to make it ongoing fodder for every talk show appearance I make. Do you understand the difference? Jonathan waved his hand dismissively. He said, What I understand is that you're being incredibly precious about this. You're in the public eye, Kit. People are interested in your life. That's the trade-off for fame. You don't get to pick and choose what people are curious about. Kit's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. He said, I absolutely get to pick and choose what I answer. Being famous doesn't make me public property. My mental health struggles are not entertainment. The fact that you think they are tells me everything I need to know about your values. Jonathan's co-host, who had been sitting quietly this whole time looking increasingly uncomfortable, tried to intervene. She said, Maybe we should all just take a breath here. Kit, Jonathan, why don't we sit back down and start fresh? Kit looked at her, his expression softening slightly. He said, I appreciate that, but no. This isn't something that can be fixed by pretending it didn't happen. Jonathan showed me exactly who he is and what he thinks is acceptable. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. Jonathan said, Oh, so now I'm the villain? I'm the bad guy for doing my job. Kit, you need some perspective. This is a talk show, not a therapy session. If you can't handle a few probing questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing press at all. Kit's laugh was bitter. He said a few probing questions. That's really how you see this. Jonathan, you spent 10 minutes trying to get me to connect my mental health crisis to my feelings about a television show. You implied I was unprofessional during filming. You suggested I had unresolved issues with my colleagues. All based on what? Tabloid speculation and gossip. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He said, I didn't imply anything. I asked questions based on public reporting. There were articles, Kit. Multiple sources said there was tension on set. I'm not making this up out of thin air. Kit's voice rose again. He said, Public reporting? You mean anonymous sources and clickbait headlines? And even if there were tensions, even if every word of those articles was true, what makes you think I owe you or anyone else an explanation? What makes you think you have the right to demand I confirm or deny gossip? The producer was trying to get Jonathan's attention now, making cutting motions with his hand, clearly wanting to go to a commercial break. Jonathan ignored him. He said, The right. I have the right because you agreed to come on this show. You signed up for an interview. That means you answer questions. Kit shook his head slowly. He said, No, Jonathan. Agreeing to do an interview doesn't mean giving up my autonomy. It doesn't mean I have to discuss whatever you decide to ask about. There are boundaries in any professional interaction. The fact that you can't seem to grasp that is genuinely concerning. Jonathan's face was fully flushed now. He said, You know what, Kit? Maybe you're right. Maybe I pushed too hard. But you're handling this terribly. You could have shut this down with grace, with humor, with the kind of charm that made you famous in the first place. Instead, you're ranting and raving like I personally attacked you. Kit's voice was cold. He said, You did personally attack me, Jonathan. Maybe not physically, but you absolutely attacked me. You took something painful and private and tried to turn it into content. You disregarded my clearly stated boundaries for your own purposes. If that's not an attack, what is it? Jonathan threw up his hands. He said, "This is ridiculous. I've had politicians on this show, people who've done genuinely controversial things, and they've handled tough questions better than you are right now. Kit, you need to toughen up. This is the entertainment industry. If you can't take the heat, get out." Kit's eyes flashed. He said, "Toughen up?" "Jonathan, I survived one of the most scrutinized television productions in history. I dealt with years of intense public attention, speculation about every aspect of my life, and yes, a very public mental health struggle. I'm plenty tough. What I'm not is willing to be disrespected." Jonathan moved closer, his voice sharp. He said, "Disrespected? I'll tell you about disrespect. Disrespect is walking off my show, embarrassing me in front of my audience, making me look like the bad guy when all I did was ask some questions. You're making this into something it isn't." Kit didn't back down. He said, "I'm making this exactly what it is. An interviewer who overstepped, who pushed past boundaries, who prioritized getting a reaction over treating his guest with basic human decency. And yes, I'm calling you out on it publicly because you did it publicly." Jonathan's voice dripped with sarcasm. He said, "Oh, how noble of you, standing up for boundaries. You're a real hero, Kit. Meanwhile, my show is falling apart. My production team is scrambling, and all because you couldn't handle a few uncomfortable questions. Grow up." Kit's face hardened. He said, "Your show is falling apart because of your choices. You could have respected my boundaries. You could have moved on when I first indicated discomfort. You chose not to. These are the consequences of your choices." Jonathan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the studio. He said, "Consequences? You think you storming off is some kind of consequence for me? Kit, I've been doing this show for years. I'll be doing it long after anyone remembers you were on it. This little tantrum of yours, it's going to make you look bad, not me." Kit tilted his head, studying Jonathan with an expression of genuine curiosity now. The anger seeming to shift into something else, he said, "Is that really what you think? That I'm going to come out of this looking like the problem?" Jonathan spread his arms wide, gesturing to the audience. He said, "Look around, Kit. Look at these people. They came here for entertainment, for a fun evening, and you're giving them a meltdown. Who do you think they're going to side with? The host who asked a few questions, or the actor who couldn't keep it together?" Kit turned to the audience, making eye contact with several people in the front rows. He said, "I think they're smarter than you're giving them credit for. I think they can see what happened here." A few people in the audience nodded. Jonathan noticed, and his expression darkened. He said, "Don't try to play to the crowd, Kit. This isn't a performance." Kit raised his eyebrows. He said, "Isn't it, though? Isn't that exactly what this is? You perform the role of the charming host. I'm supposed to perform the role of the grateful guest, and together we create entertainment. The problem is, you changed the script without telling me. You decided we were doing a different kind of show, the kind where you get to dig into trauma for laughs or gasps or whatever reaction you were hoping for." Jonathan's co-host tried again. She said, "Kit, Jonathan, we have an audience here. We're live. Can we please just find a way to move forward? Jonathan, maybe an apology would help smooth things over?" Jonathan whipped around to face her. He said, "An apology? For what? For doing my job? Absolutely not. Kit can apologize to me for disrupting my show if he wants, but I have nothing to apologize for." Kit looked at the co-host and said quietly, "Thank you for trying. I appreciate that someone here seems to understand this." Got out of hand. Jonathan turned back to Kit, his voice low and intense now. He said, "You want to know what really bothers me about this, Kit? It's the hypocrisy. You're an actor. Your entire career is built on people being interested in you, in your life, in your thoughts and feelings. You court that attention when it benefits you. You do magazine covers, you do interviews, you attend premieres. You want all the benefits of fame, but none of the scrutiny that comes with it." Kit's voice was equally quiet, but firm. He said, "There's a difference between scrutiny and invasiveness, Jonathan. There's a difference between public interest and public ownership." Jonathan scoffed. He said, "That's a convenient line to draw. And who decides where that line is? Based on your feelings in any given moment." Kit nodded slowly. He said, "Yes, actually. I decide where my boundaries are. Just like you decide where yours are. Just like every human being has the right to decide what they're comfortable discussing. Fame doesn't erase that right. Jonathan shot back. But fame does change the equation. You can't have it both ways. You can't be a public figure and then claim privacy whenever it suits you. Kit's voice rose slightly again. He said, I'm not claiming privacy about everything, Jonathan. I'm claiming it about specific, deeply personal aspects of my life. My medical history, my mental health treatment, things that have nothing to do with my work as an actor. If you'd asked me about my process, about the play, about my career trajectory, about the craft of acting, I would have talked for hours. But you didn't want that conversation. You wanted the messy stuff, the painful stuff, because that's what gets clicks and views. Jonathan stepped closer, his face inches from Kit's now. He said, You're damn right I wanted the interesting stuff. Nobody tunes in to hear actors drone on about their process. They want to know the real person. They want honesty. Kit didn't back away. He said, Honesty has to be voluntary. Jonathan, you can't extract it from someone by badgering them. And real people have the right to keep some things private, even from curious audiences, especially the things that involve their health and well-being. Jonathan's voice was tight with anger now. He said, This is such nonsense. Every other actor who comes on this show manages to handle difficult questions without falling apart. What makes you so special? Why do you get to set different rules? Kit's response was immediate. He said, I'm not setting different rules. I'm enforcing basic human boundaries that should apply to everyone. The fact that other guests haven't stood up for themselves doesn't mean I'm wrong to do so. Maybe it means they should have. Jonathan threw his hands up in exasperation. He said, Unbelievable. So now you're not just defending yourself. You're positioning yourself as some kind of champion for all the guests who've been on my show. Kit, you're delusional. You're having a breakdown on live television and trying to make it sound noble. Kit's voice was steady. He said, I'm not having a breakdown, Jonathan. A breakdown is what happens when someone can't cope with pressure. What you're seeing is someone who's coped with plenty and knows exactly what they're doing. I'm making a choice to leave rather than continue an interaction that's harmful. The producer was frantically signaling now, but both men ignored him. Jonathan said, Harmful? You think me asking you questions is harmful? Do you hear yourself? Kit replied, I think you were attempting to force me to discuss my mental health struggles on camera, after I clearly indicated I wasn't comfortable with it. Yes, that's harmful. It's disrespectful at minimum, potentially damaging at worst. What if I wasn't in a good place right now? What if your questions triggered something? Did you even consider that? Jonathan's face showed a flicker of something, maybe doubt, but he pushed forward. He said, Oh, so now I'm responsible for your mental state. Kit, if you're that fragile, maybe you shouldn't be doing public appearances at all. Kit's jaw clenched. He said, Fragile. Asking someone to respect boundaries isn't fragile, Jonathan. It's healthy. It's what therapists teach people to do. The fragile thing would be sitting here, letting you push me around, and then falling apart later in private. I'm strong enough to stand up for myself in the moment. Jonathan looked around at his crew, at the audience, seeming to realize for the first time that this wasn't playing the way he expected. He said, his tone shifting slightly, Look, Kit, maybe we both got a bit heated here. Television is live. Emotions run high. These things happen. Why don't we sit back down, finish the interview properly, and part as friends? Kit shook his head. He said, We're not friends, Jonathan. We're professional acquaintances at best. And no, I'm not sitting back down. You've shown me who you are. I believe you. I'm leaving. Jonathan's anger flared again. He said, Fine, leave. Walk off. But know this, Kit, this is going to follow you. Every interview you do after this, people are going to remember that you couldn't handle the Jonathan Ross show. They're going to wonder what you're hiding. They're going to think you're difficult to work with. Is that really what you want? Kit stopped, turned back one final time. He said, What I want is to maintain my integrity and my boundaries. If that makes me difficult in your eyes or anyone else's, I can live with that. What I can't live with is compromising my values for the sake of appearing agreeable. Jonathan's voice was cold now. He said, Integrity, boundaries, values. You're very good at throwing around big words, Kit, but at the end of the day, you're just another actor who couldn't handle a tough interview. That's all this is. That's all anyone is going to remember. Kit smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd shown in minutes. He said, You know what, Jonathan? I think you're wrong. I think people are going to remember an actor who stood up for himself when a host went too far. I think they're going to remember a host who valued content over consent. Time will tell which one of us is right. With that, Kit Harington turned and walked off the set. The microphone pack he'd removed earlier was still in his hand. He handed it to a stunned production assistant and kept walking. The audience sat in absolute silence for a moment. Then scattered applause broke out, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Jonathan stood alone on the stage, his expression unreadable. His co-host had her face in her hands. The producer was shouting into his headset. And Kit Harington walked out of the studio door without looking back. Jonathan finally seemed to register that he was still on camera, still live. He turned to the audience, his famous smile struggling to return to his face. He said, "Well, that was unexpected. I suppose we've all just witnessed something rather unprecedented. Kit Harington, ladies and gentlemen, very passionate about his boundaries." The joke fell flat. The audience didn't laugh. Jonathan cleared his throat and said, "We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have our next guest. I promise they'll be slightly less dramatic." But as the show cut to commercial, the damage was done. The tension in that room was palpable. The audience members were turning to each other, whispering, debating what they'd just seen. So there you have it. The full story of what happened when Kit Harington walked onto the Jonathan Ross show and walked right back off again. A conversation that started friendly and ended in confrontation.